charter says.
Well,
Lawsuit or no lawsuit, that isn't what the charter says.
if I may address that, because I think that's an incorrect statement. If I can go back to one other issue,
Gary,
though,
go
in
ahead.
terms of, because the issue was raised with me, and I said, she's a city council member. She's entitled to receive it without having to go through a FOIA request. We've already covered this ground before when we
Yes,
had
we
the
did.
issue. So there was no need for a FOIA request and no need for any expense or anything else. And I think Marge would verify that that's what I told you when I spoke to you with regard to that. So the idea was, let's just truncate this, but I was interested in knowing what it was about because she was going to be receiving it based on her status as a city council member without having to go through FOIA or without having to go through any other process. It is public information, but we need to make sure that we can protect the city with regard to the information in this situation. So in this situation, I want to know what we were looking at. And Marge ended up basically saying it was for her personal information. And
Mr.
she would have
Chair.
been able to get it regardless, but I still ended up asking the question because I have to know what's going on. And I have to be able to advise our outside counsel with respect to that. So with regard to that issue, basically the idea was to short circuit the idea of anyone on the city council having to go through any sort of process with respect to FOIA because you don't have to, given the authority you have under the charter.
Well,
It's that simple.
Any citizen or any resident would have access to that same
They
information.
would have access to that same information, but they would have to go through a certain process and would end up having to pay any sort of cost that would end up being associated with
Not
it.
necessarily a FOIA.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Other
normally they would
residents
end up
do.
going through a FOIA or through or act under the provision under the city charter that allows those records to be public.
But you could just copy it when it shows on the tape.
Right. Well, and but the point is we need to know what is going on because with respect to certain litigation, we've had people trying to use inappropriate methods to get around the discovery process, and it has been an ongoing problem. And it has required us to end up taking additional measures that should be absolutely unnecessary to end up addressing this issue. We don't want people to try to short-circuit the discovery process, and this particular litigant is doing that on an ongoing basis. And that's what our concern is. Getting back to the idea of temporary appointments, the city code specifically allows for a temporary appointment to a position for a period of up to 6 months. It is not based on the identity of that particular individual. It is based on the position. So you could end up having a person in multiple temporary appointments if the requirements of the code are met. It is not a matter of that individual one way or the other. It does not say that the position is going to end up being in issue if it's the same person. It's a question of whether or not that position needs to be filled on a temporary basis, and then you go through the process. It's not a question of who that person is. So I disagree with what the statement was that Marge made with regard to that, because I don't think that's a fair reading of the city ordinance whatsoever.
Councilwoman Bedlow?
Since it was brought up by the